This is where it all began in 1963, where the Organization of African Unity decided to host its headquarters here in Addis Ababa.
This summit is very special as it would define the next 50 years of the continent's future. But the image of Africa has suffered broadly in the last 50 years, especially outside the continent. 50 years on, how can Africa change the way it is perceived outside the continent?
So we must develop our own narrative and talk about ourselves, the way we see ourselves, not the way other people see us. And that is very important.
Because examples of the Times magazine has always been quoted several times, and that seems to be the benchmark of
But we hope that people like you, our own journalists, will not be quoting what the Times say and taking your stories from there, but that you will be giving the stories from Africa out, rather than taking what other people are saying about Africa and then making it your own narrative.
The situation in Central African Republic also didn't actually help in case of that.
Yeah, the peace and security has been issued many statements about that, and if you follow their communiques, you will know what you are saying.
The main agenda at this summit is to deliberate on the African Union flagship agenda for the continent called the Agenda 2063, which is looking at the current and future transformation of the continent. At this gathering of the Executive Council of the Commission, which is made up of finance ministers of member states of the African Union Commission, business here is crucial as the ministers will adopt a draft proclamation and prepare recommendations for their various heads of state, and the head of state will make the final decision during their meeting at this summit.
This is at the stage where serious business of this summit of African Union begins, where the ministers of Africa or across Africa are all gathered here to discuss some of the business that is going to take Africa forward in the next 50 years.
Another issue this summit looked to address is the increasing urbanization of Africa.
Many times, what we call urbanization is in reality ruralization of urban areas. When you aggregate slums to urban areas, this is not urbanization, it is ruralization of urban areas. And the cost of that ruralization of urban areas is evidently very high in terms of sanitation, in terms of access to education, in terms of transport management and so on. So we need to look at that. The second issue is that urbanization, which is a ruralization of urban areas, takes place because people in rural areas don't get enough wealth. So the diversification of the rural economy is not pertinent enough to have them stay in rural areas. That's the second issue. And the third issue is a demographic issue. The majority of the people in our continent are young, as you know. We are the youngest continent in the world. And a very high proportion of our rural areas are composed also by youth who want to leave these rural areas and then create a problem of capacity to produce. So if you put these three factors together, you need to say to yourself, well, Africa has known a good economic growth rate in the last 6 to 7 years, but our rural areas and our rural populations are poorer. The growth rates are good, but the level of poverty have increased in rural areas. So if we don't manage that efficiently, we have a time bomb. So in order to manage it, we need to rethink the way we look at development, have a much more focused attention on territorial rural dimensions, have a greater focus on empowering rural inhabitants so that they can have the incentives to stay in rural areas. That will help us have a more equilibrated spatial development.
The Implementation Division of the African Union is the new partnership for Africa known as NEPAD. One of their tasks is to engage with those Africans who reside beyond the boundaries of the continent to participate in the continent's transformative agenda.
I noticed that NEPAD has been engaging very much with the African diaspora in terms of investment. How's that going so far?
It started slowly, but it is picking up pace. And we at NEPAD believe that the African diaspora must participate in the development of its continent. Intellectually, investment-wise, they have to be here. Because, it doesn't suffice to be outside and say things are not happening. We need to be able, as active and interested Africans living abroad with potential, to bring that potential to support the development of the continent, both in terms of thinking, and the Rural Futures Program has a big component on analytical work. So we hope to call on expertise all over the world, African expertise all over the world, to be able to do that analytical work to help the planning and decision-making process. We want to also encourage Africans, investors, to come back home and invest. I think governments are doing well in terms of creating enabling conditions to support investment. We're not going to have this change and transformation by counting only on public funding. I think a huge part of it has to be driven by the private sector. And yes, the governments have the responsibility to create enabling conditions for investment to happen. As the diaspora, there is the responsibility to say, we want to go back home and contribute to this transformative agenda. And it is beginning to happen. So we are very delighted in NEPAD, and we want to pursue that way. And for what you're doing as a journalist, is also supporting that agenda of change, and we hope that we will continue this collaboration.
The African Union say it has made its headquarters to be a people's center. This simply implies the symbol of this building is not only for the diplomat and official who come here, but also to the ordinary people.
What are you doing here?
I'm participating the African Union Choir.
Okay, are you all from Addis Ababa or you come from different countries?
No, I'm from Burundi.
You're from Burundi?
Yeah.
And you are from?
Addis.
From Addis.
Yes.
Okay, and you are from?
Addis.
Addis. Okay, and you are from?
Addis.
There is no doubt that the pragmatic consensus is that Africa has the highest economic growth potential of any continent in the world today, and with that positive factor on the ground, make investment opportunities in the continent incredibly diverse.
Ethiopia is one of Africa's fastest growing economies, although there is still significant amount of poverty, but the growth rate can be measured by evidence of such massive constructions that are going on here in Addis Ababa. This monumental transformation is mainly driven by the Ethiopian diaspora, who are investing in many sectors and pushing for a new type of middle class.
One of the very special events in this Golden Jubilee Summit was the Youth and Leaders Dialogue meeting. In the presence of one of the founding fathers of the Organization of Africa Unity and one of the youngest presidents in the continent, young people from across the continent posed their issues and concerns on youth contribution in the business of the African Union.
I have some demands, and I want, because the Honorable President will ask me what can we do, so I have some demands for you. One, is going to the AU Chairperson, Madam Zuma. We need a commissioner for youth and children affairs. A commissioner and a director for youth and children affairs. We don't want youth issues to be on an ad hoc basis. Yeah, that's one. Number two, the leaders, you have to groom us by including us as part of your official delegates to the meetings you go to. And we don't want to bring your relatives and your friends and the rest of them and the governments. We want the young people that are the rest of the people. Number three, you have to, the only solution to African youth problem is to rectify and implement implement the African Union Charter.
So maybe we could have an interim measure where we could have maybe a desk also in the chairperson's office that looks at you. Those are the things that we can do before the member states can take a decision. But I also want to just say the Constitutive Act somewhere says the AU must be driven by its citizens. And so it's driven by its government, but also it says it must be driven by its citizens. And it is the citizens, and as you are part of those citizens, that must make sure that there was a question of how much is implemented. The implementation takes place at member state level. And it's up to you as the citizens of all these countries to ensure that the governments implement what they've agreed on here at the AU. And of course, we say the youth are the majority. It means they are the majority of voters. And no government can be voted in without the youth having voted for them. So you have to make sure that in the manifestos, but you must also participate. Earlier I said you must participate in the political life of your countries. Don't just sit in the margins, because in the political life, that's where the manifestos for elections are made, that's where policies are made. And if the youth is an integral part of that, then we will not need a lot of sessions where we ask our governments, because we'll be an integral part. So my message to you is, you say, and I agree with you, you are not only the future, but you are the present, but get engaged, get involved, and change what you want to change within the countries, but also make sure that what is agreed here is implemented at the level of the member states. Thank you.
Another important issue presented by the youth to their leaders here was the issue of single passport for all Africans.
The solution to these problems may not necessarily be for us to confine ourselves within our traditional national borders, but to actually move and to move with haste as an African continent towards greater interdependence.
The Organization of African Union has no control over Zambia. Zambia is a member of the Organization of African Union, but the chairman of African Union has no control over Zambia. They can't dictate to us. Zambia makes its own laws to suit the environment of people of Zambia. And two, Africa, the biggest crime which we are facing is crime. And once you say you're going to have one passport, criminals will be dancing when they have one passport. Because if you have one passport, you can come to Ethiopia still, go to Nairobi still, go to Malawi still, go to South Africa still.
Investment in agriculture is also badly needed in Africa. Campaign groups like Action Aid and One are at the forefront of campaigning for governments in Africa to invest more in agriculture.
But if you can have a tax regime that really encourages them to grow and to thrive, I think that's the role that government can play. And as I said, as government plays this role, it actually begins to catalyze the engagement and the involvement of private sector. And private sector brings in huge amounts of money, brings in huge amounts of opportunity. For farmers in agriculture.
I think the most important point Ajui mentioned inside is that to ensure that what the country, what has been committed through CADEP for the countries to allocate 10% of their budget, their public finance for agriculture, that's of critical importance. We are currently about, from our research, 8 countries out of 54 after 10 years of CADEP achieving that. There is significant improvement in agricultural financing overall, but it will be critical to meet its own food security requirement and to be a major player in terms of food production and even it has the potential to support many parts of the world, to ensure that investment happens, number one. Number two is that it is just not about a finance figure. It's not about just 10% in financial terms. It's about also the quality aspect of it. Certainly, government need to ensure that it is investing in the right kind of capital stock, which means that it has to invest in creating infrastructure, the roads, the irrigation facilities, the hardware part of it. And what we have seen from our experience, once that happens, that if a primary producer, if a small farmer, if a woman is able to sell his or her surpluses after taking care of his or her subsistence need to sell in the market for profit, then they will invest in their own land. They will develop their own agricultural activities. That investment is never understood by the governments. So it is about the 10% that government is putting, the 10% of public financing that government is bringing in. But there is an enormous amount of investment that's created by small farmers and women farmers themselves, which is not recognized. And so there is a triggering effect. So government does its 10% means in the quality criteria that we are using, how that investment should be used for. Then there will be a lot of other investment kick in from the primary producers, from the small holders. And I must also reinforce the point that this is not about the investment alone. Why we are emphasizing so much about the small farmers and women farmers is that they do not just are there for producing optimally from the land. They also take care of the land. They also ensure the balance of the environment. They manage the world. They manage the land. They manage the resources as if they are their own child. So that connection is very important. So technology is important. Knowledge base is important. Research is important. Extension service is important. And what we are seeing is that when governments are talking about investment, they're more spending money in subsidizing fertilizers, subsidizing agricultural chemical inputs and all that, which we are afraid probably not necessarily the most sustainable way forward. What's the most sustainable way forward is to believe that there are the small-scale farmers, the women farmers in particular, who constitute of 80% of the farming community, are at the heart of the agriculture debate and the investment.
What's the key?
For me, it's not in the past, in the sense that there are a couple of messages that come through the Pan-African movement that are still relevant. The message of unity, the message about diversity and richness of the African continent in terms of its cultural heritage, and also the message about solidarity. So those messages are still important. But now we have to modernize. We have to make sure that when we talk about integration, it's not just political integration. It's about how we trade better, how the markets are going to be free-flowing within countries in Africa, how we can have an industrial policy for the continent that takes into account the opportunities of a larger market, because that's what will make a difference for us to move from a still rather agrarian economy in terms of number of people employed in agricultural sector, 70%, into a much more modernized Africa, an Africa that is going to be more urban, more youthful and more connected.
Africa also has a problem with its image outside Africa. How do you think we can turn around that when we still have issues, although there's been progress being done, but there's also an issue with some of this conflict that flags up now and then? Like I'm talking, for example, the Central African Republic of recent, the coup d'etat that took place there. That doesn't help very much in our image.
No, I agree, and I think that we have to be cognizant that if Africans don't take care of their conflicts, this narrative about conflicts and Africa being prone for instability is going to remain. We know that other regions are doing much better in terms of their branding, but not so better in terms of managing their conflicts. But somehow, because Africans don't take care of their conflicts themselves, to a large extent they are starting to do it, but not enough. We have most of the conflicts in Africa ending up in the agenda of the Security Council, therefore with spotlight. And this is what we have to struggle against.
What will be your wish for the next 50 years for Africa?
My wish is that we take into account the fact that we are going to be the youngest continent. So the megatrends are in favor of Africa. But if you don't take care of the demographic dividend, you end up with a disaster. So it is really for the leadership and all of us. And when I say leadership, I think particularly leadership of the youth to take Africa's future in their hands. We should remember that when Lumumba died, he was 37 years old.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. It's a pleasure.